We begin with further progress in negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. The leaders of Britain, France, and Germany have underlined their support for U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to end the war following a meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has meanwhile said that revised U.S. peace proposals are workable and that Kyiv has a, quote, common understanding with Washington. Despite that positive language, Russia has launched another wave of drone and missile attacks against Ukraine, killing at least 7 people in Kyiv.
Far from diplomatic discussions, this is the deadly reality of Russia's war in Ukraine. These Kyiv residents escaped an overnight drone strike and have little hope that the attacks will stop anytime soon.
I can't believe that while negotiations are happening, so many people died today, in Kyiv alone. They're doing this. I just don't have any faith. I hate this, as much as a person can hate.
Ukraine launched its own overnight attacks on Russia, targeting an oil terminal and Black Sea port. There's been a flurry of international activity in recent days to end the fighting. A US-brokered peace plan worked on in Geneva set off some alarm bells, with the initial draft favouring Russia's demands that Ukraine cede territory and reduce its armed forces. Ukraine worked with its European allies to make its position clear.
That Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained, that Ukraine should be able to defend herself in future, and that matters about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. We are clear their voice must always be at the heart of the process, and elements relating to Europe and NATO will need the consent of Europe and NATO members.
Kyiv is now hopeful it can get the US on board. National Security Chief Rustem Umerov posted on social media that there was a, quote, common understanding on core terms. He's pushing to get an urgent meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and US President Donald Trump, in the hope Trump might be able to sway Russia, an obvious stumbling block in the peace plan. The White House is showing signs of optimism. In a statement, it said those remaining sticking points to end the war are not insurmountable, but will require more negotiation.
DW's Nick Conley in Kyiv brought us up to date on negotiations between Ukraine and the US.
It's all a bit feverish here, with lots of reports based on anonymous sources seeming to show negotiations going one way or the other and then being contradicted. It had seemed recently, just a couple of hours ago, that the Ukrainian side had agreed, in theory, to limit the size of its military during peacetime to 800,000. Now Ukrainian media with kind of credible sources seems to suggest that that isn't the case. So I think it is very important to stress that this is all very kind of still open, and that the American side definitely doesn't have any kind of very principled red lines and all of this. They just want to get this done, ideally by Thanksgiving at the end of this week. But certainly, limiting the size of the military in peacetime, at least at a size like 800,000, if that ever were to happen, that is less of a red line, less of a problem for Ukraine than signing away the option of joining NATO or, giving away territory. So I think there is going to be some flexibility from the Ukrainian side on this, but what it ends up being is still pretty far off.
All right, Nick Connolly there in Kyiv. I'm joined now by Ivana Stradner. She's a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome. These Russian attacks that we're seeing on Ukraine coming after Kyiv seemingly fended off the first draft of this peace plan coming from the U.S. It had a lot of Russian-backed points to it. Are these attacks from Russia, can we say that we're seeing frustration here about the way things have gone, or is there a strategy? What do you see?
Every time when we offer Russia to negotiate, Putin actually gives us so-called gift, basically, with more attacks on Ukraine. That tells us all we need to know what Russia actually thinks about negotiation in good faith. This is a typical Putin's old KGB tactic to intimidate the West and to tell people, not only in the West, but also in Ukraine, that he's serious about continuing an attack. And then actually he is, because make no mistake, Putin does not want to end this war in the long run anytime soon. What he needs to do now and what he's trying to do is to use time for negotiations to basically strengthen his military, to reposition and to continue. And that's precisely, this is a typical Russian negotiation tactic with the 28-point plan to ask absolutely ridiculous maximalist demands and to portray Zelenskyy as a non-reliable partner. I have to admit, I'm very pleased to see that that Kyiv is negotiating this treaty and is actually putting Moscow on the defensive and portraying Moscow as the non-reliable partner. Because Putin understands very well all the talking points, not only about ceding the territory, not only about NATO and military. What worries me even more is their influence operations campaign related to so-called peace through trade. And that's precisely, they sent an envoy in Washington, D.C.
You know, speaking of Putin and sort of the Kremlin being put on the defensive from a peace plan that was backed with its own talking points here, we know that a U.S. envoy is meeting with Putin to talk about next steps after these first negotiations. Do you believe the framework is still a living document with potential for Russia, or is it basically dead on arrival now because it's been altered from these maximalist points?
Mr. Witkoff, I'm afraid that he really sometimes does not understand how the Kremlin thinks. He believes that Putin wants to negotiate and that economy matters, and that by bringing Russia closer to the U.S. in terms of lifting sanctions and economic incentives, that is going to alter the behavior of Putin. That's a very, very wrong way of thinking. As a matter of fact, I don't think that no matter what we offer Putin right now, that he is going to be happy about this. Nevertheless, he wants to make sure that those negotiations last as long as possible. So basically, to make sure that President Trump eventually becomes very, very annoyed and bored by this and gives up. And then to put, the ball in Europe's court and to make sure that the alliance is divided. We should not fall for this trick.
Given the dynamics in the White House, the fact that Trump seems to favor Putin's view of the war and its advantage, is this peace framework, despite all this optimistic language that we're hearing from Ukraine, from European allies, is it still quite dangerous for Ukraine?
I would not say, that President Trump wants to favor specifically Russia. I'm afraid, that President Trump does not understand that negotiating with Putin requires more than real estate negotiation techniques. And he thought, by offering Putin what he wants, that Putin is going to say yes, and that Ukraine will have no choice but to be forced, to sign that. That's not really how negotiations with Russia work. So I'm quite certain that President Trump will eventually get really, really upset with the Russian demands that are, make no mistake, going to happen within the next few days. Probably again citing the question of sovereignty and history, all those things that will not definitely resonate with Washington. I firmly believe that we have to really make sure that we do not leave sanctions on Russia anytime soon and be ready to help Ukraine with security guarantees and weapons. Because Russia will eventually move forward. And my last point, which is extremely important, Russia is already at hybrid war with the West, and we have to acknowledge that.
All right, that's Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Ivana, thank you very much.
Always pleasure. Thank you.
Angela Stent is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on US-Russia policy. Welcome to DW. President Zelenskyy says the list of steps to end this war is becoming workable, in his words. Despite this, many Ukrainians fear that any deal might mean capitulation. What do you think a non-capitulation settlement might look like in practice?
So it has to be a settlement where Ukraine remains a sovereign state, free to make choices about what foreign policy and what alliances it wants to be part of. It also has to be a settlement where Ukraine does not have to give up territory to Russia, which Russia doesn't control. So I think what's acceptable to the Ukrainians would be a ceasefire. It could be immediate along the current lines of control. In other words, Ukraine would have to accept that for the time being, Russia does occupy about 18% of its territory, but it would not have to give up land that it controls and Russia doesn't control. It would not agree to enshrine in its constitution that it will never join NATO. It wants to retain the freedom to choose to join the European Union if the European Union will have it, and possibly at some future date NATO, although that's a long way off. And I think it would also not accept the original provision in the Trump-Putin plan, which said there would be amnesty for both sides.
Right.
The Russians have to be held accountable for the invasion.
Okay, so still a long way to go then in those talks. Although it's interesting that you talk about the possibility that Ukraine would accept being occupied without formally giving up territory. So you're anticipating this going on for years.
So, I mean, I think if there's a ceasefire, the Ukrainians would, again, de facto recognize that Russia controls Crimea and a swath of land in eastern Ukraine. I think for the main thing for the Ukrainians it would be, if there were such a ceasefire and successfully implemented, that it would have security guarantees from Europe and hopefully with a backstop from the United States, that Russia couldn't just wait 6 months, refurbish its army and its weapons, and then reinvade. So for Ukrainians, another key point is to what extent can they be protected from a future invasion by Russia? Because as we know, Russia has broken every agreement that it signed with Ukraine since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about security guarantees that would be necessary to secure any future peace. Do you detect any willingness on the part of this White House to commit American troops to this?
Certainly no American troops. What the White House now says is they have amended the original agreement and have said that the U.S. would commit to providing, quote unquote, Article 5 type guarantees. In other words, the NATO collective defense clauses to Ukraine were there a future Russian invasion. That's rather vague. It doesn't specify the criteria for that. But no, this administration would certainly not commit any troops. And it's some of the European countries, the coalition of the willing, have been discussing that, but that's also to be determined.
It's also further complicated. If you've accepted Russian troops on Ukrainian territory, what then constitutes an invasion?
Well, I suppose, that's a great question. And one thing that's not in either of those, of the planned peace plans that we've seen so far is anything about Russia withdrawing troops from the areas that it now occupies. Clearly it would have to withdraw some. So another invasion would constitute beginning bombing Ukraine again, as Russia has been doing ferociously for the past few months, and presumably then sending troops to move over the lines where Russia currently occupies and move further into Ukrainian territory.
Thursday of this week was another Trump deadline for a deal, which now appears to be shifting once more. What do you believe is driving these hurried pushes from the Trump White House?
Well, President Trump has wanted this war to end for a long time. He's been quite clear about that. We know that the agreement, the first 28-point plan we saw, was negotiated over several months. But the fact that it was leaked last week, and it was probably leaked by the Russians, is trying to put pressure on Zelenskyy since he's facing a corruption scandal at home and since the situation on the battlefield is very difficult for Ukraine. And so I think once this plan was leaked, presumably the Trump administration would like to get this settled quickly. But clearly it's not going to be signed and sealed on Thursday. And Secretary of State Rubio has certainly said this is a living document that will still be worked on. And we've just heard Foreign Minister Lavrov earlier on today say that Russia will not accept a new plan worked out by the Ukrainians and the US on Sunday in Geneva if that plan does not adhere to Russia's basic demands.
What's the American or else on this? If Ukraine, as President Zelenskyy said earlier this week, has to choose between its dignity and its American allies, and Ukraine chooses dignity, what is the Washington plan to then say, OK, well, you chose your fate, we'll leave you to it?
Right. So President Trump has said, if they don't want to take this, they can go on fighting. Yes, it would be possibly a loss of U.S. intelligence support, which has been very important for the Ukrainians in identifying, how to deal with Russian attacks, and presumably a halt to this Pearl program. This is a program by which European countries buy American weapons and then give them to Ukraine. So the cessation of intelligence support, of possible weapons deliveries. I don't know about the sanctions. President Trump hasn't said anything about that. I mean, in the original plan that the US and Russia worked out, the sanctions would be slowly removed if Russia complied with the treaty. But for the Ukrainians, it would mean a loss of very important American support going forward.
Thank you so much for talking us through that so clearly, Angela. Angela Stent from the American Enterprise Institute.
Thank you, too.